The taiga stood majestic and inhospitable, like a giant green ocean frozen in eternity. Tall pines, slender and dark, reached their peaks into the low leaden sky, under which every step of the detachment sounded like boots gnawing into the moist earth. The air was heavy, saturated with the smell of tar and rotting leaves, and in the distance, out of sight, there seemed to be an elusive whisper. Captain Pyotr Andreevich Rostovsky strode ahead, as a commander should. He was 35, but a harsh life, from fighting at the front to nighttime interrogations, had left deep marks on his face. Tall, thin, with a face that did not linger with a smile, he was a man of business, accustomed to strict execution of orders. And this order was strange even by the standards of post-war service. To go to the Siberian wilderness where, according to intelligence reports, an anomalous phenomenon was discovered, and, if possible, to study it. To involve scientific personnel in the study of anomalies, complete secrecy must be observed. Report daily. Signed, Beria. Behind Pyotr Andreevich, a squad was moving. 3 of his loyal operatives were trusted people who knew when to ask questions and when to keep quiet. Behind them were the scientists. Professor Kuznetsov, a large, elderly man with a bushy mustache who carried thick folders of drawings and notes, and his young assistants, 3 men and 1 woman, each with a device in their hands. 10 soldiers brought up the rear with weapons at the ready, and somewhere to the side crept a local guide, a skinny, wizened old man with a stooped back, whose name was Vasily. "Wait!" Vasily suddenly said, abruptly raising his hand. The party stopped, and all eyes turned to the old guide. Vasily stood motionless, only his eyes darted quickly over the surrounding trees. Then he turned to the captain, his face ashen. "We can't go any further," he said in a hoarse voice. "This is a bad place. Damn it!" Rostovsky frowned. He was used to the superstitions of the peasants, but something in Vasily's tone made him wary. "Why? What is it?" he asked shortly. "The spirits are here," Vasily whispered, crossing himself. "Evil spirits. They can hear us. They're waiting." The soldiers exchanged glances. Some also whispered, and some crossed themselves after the old man. But the captain remained steadfast. "Go ahead," he said coldly. "An order is an order." Vasily hesitated, but under the pressure of the captain's gaze, he nevertheless stepped forward. The squad moved on. The clearing mentioned in the reports was suddenly discovered. At first, the trees began to thin out, and then a patch of bare land surrounded by dense thickets spread out in front of people. The grass here was low and sparse, and in the very center of the clearing it seemed as if the air was trembling. The captain stopped and motioned for the group to disperse. The scientists came closer, taking out their instruments. Kuznetsov sat down and ran his hand over the grass. "The ground is cold, although there should be no frost here. And..." He paused, then looked at the device in his hand. The magnetic field behaves strangely." Nobody paid much attention to the professor's words, except for Rostovsky. But the captain himself felt a strange pressure. It wasn't fear, which he had long ago learned to deal with, but something else, a heavy, sticky feeling, as if an invisible eye was boring into the back of his head. "Do you see that?" The voice of one of the assistants broke the silence. Everyone turned around. The assistant pointed to the center of the clearing, where the air was shaking especially violently. Looking closely, one could see a faint distortion, like a mirage over hot asphalt, only without any heat. "What is it?" one of the soldiers asked. Kuznetsov came closer, carefully taking a step. It's a kind of refraction of light," he began. "Although..." The professor suddenly stopped. His gaze caught on the distortion. His eyes narrowed, and then he quickly retreated. "That's impossible!" "What did you see?" Rostovsky asked sharply. Kuznetsov was silent for a few seconds before answering.
"There's something there. But it's not in our world."
The professor's words caused a slight stir among the soldiers and scientists. Even the guide Vasily, who was standing at the edge of the clearing, stared in horror at the center of the anomaly. The night came quickly. The camp was set up at what seemed to be a safe distance from the clearing, but no one felt at ease. People were talking in whispers, and the fire crackled, casting dancing shadows on the trees. Rostovsky could not sleep. There were strange sounds outside the tent. Not footsteps, not whispers, but something indistinct, like a distant call. As he went outside, he saw that the sentries were standing tensely, their faces pale. "Is everything okay?" he asked. "Yes, comrade captain," one of the soldiers replied. But it was obvious that this was a lie. The sky above the taiga seemed lower, the stars burned brighter, and an oppressive, dead silence crept around, broken only by the sound of his footsteps. The morning in the taiga began with a thick, heavy fog. It swirled between the trees like waves of white smoke, absorbing the sounds and creating a feeling of complete isolation. The camp woke up slowly. The soldiers looked tired, and the scientists were talking tensely, examining the instruments. No one got enough sleep. The taiga itself seemed to seep with anxiety, and even the birds, usually noisy at dawn, fell silent. Captain Rostovsky watched the proceedings with cold attention. It seemed to him that everyone had become quieter, as if they were afraid to wake up something slumbering in the center of the clearing. Vasily, the local guide, was frowning at the pot, grumbling to himself. The soldiers, usually rude and noisy, ate in silence, stealing glances in the direction of the anomaly. "Today we will conduct the first serious tests," Professor Kuznetsov said, loudly snapping the clasp of his briefcase. "It is necessary to establish the nature of the object." He spoke confidently, but doubt was clearly reflected on the professor's face. Even Rostovsky could see how he automatically adjusted his glasses over and over again, tugged at his sleeve and shifted from one foot to the other. They returned to the clearing an hour later. The fog had cleared by this time, but there was a strange coolness, as if everything here was in eternal shadow. This time, the scientists brought more equipment with them, portable generators, antennas, and even a strange device resembling a bunch of mirrors. When the first group approached the anomaly, something changed. The distortion that was trembling in the center of the clearing became more pronounced. Now you could see that it wasn't just shaking. It was throbbing like a living heart, reacting to the approach of people. "It's not just an optical effect anymore," one of the assistants muttered, his voice trembling. "It's like we're being called." The professor cut him off abruptly. "Scientific terms, comrade. This is probably a new kind of natural phenomenon." But no one believed in his confidence. Even Rostovsky felt that something around them seemed to be watching them. "Turn on the generator," Kuznetsov ordered. A metal probe was carefully inserted into the ground near the anomaly. Nothing happened for a moment, and then a flash. It was sharp and blinding, as if someone had taken a picture right in front of his eyes. The probe suddenly began to bend, as if it was being pulled in different directions by an invisible force. The metal twisted like a soft wire, and in a second, it was gone. "He's gone," one of the scientists shouted. There was an oppressive silence in the camp. In the place where the probe was, there was only a black, scorched mark on the ground. "That's impossible!" Kuznetsov gasped. "Perhaps or not," Rostovsky interrupted him. "But you're here to understand that." Kuznetsov said nothing. He continued to write down the data, his hands visibly shaking. Vasily stood in the distance, at the edge of the clearing, and crossed himself all the time. He did not approach closer than 30 steps from the anomaly. When Rostovsky approached him, the old man, almost in desperation, grabbed the captain by the sleeve. "Go away, comrade captain, before it's too late. It's not just a place. It's a hole in the world where you don't have to look." "What do you know?" Rostovsky asked harshly. "Nothing. I don't know anything," Vasily pleaded. "I just heard. My grandfather said that there had been victims here before, that the souls of the departed gather here, and now you want to take a look there. This is the end. Rostovsky released the guide, but his words stuck in his head. By nightfall, the camp was tense again. This time, as dusk descended on the taiga, the anomaly began to emit a barely noticeable light, dim, green, like a swamp light. People looked at her in horror, but no one dared to approach. "Pyotr Andreevich!" Suddenly there was a loud whisper. The captain turned around. One of the sentries stood with his eyes wide open and pointed towards the forest with a shaking hand. There was something moving among the trees. At first it seemed like just a shadow, but it soon became clear. It's a silhouette of a man. "Who's there?" Rostovsky asked loudly, pulling out his pistol. The silhouette did not respond. He stood motionless, hidden in the semi-darkness. Then Rostovsky took a step forward, but before he could say anything else, the figure disappeared as if it had never existed. At night, when the camp was already asleep, Rostovsky had a strange dream. He was standing in the same clearing, but there was no one around. No trees, no grass. Only a black void and a trembling anomaly that suddenly began to speak. Her voice was low, booming, but at the same time human. "You belong to me too," it said. The captain woke up in a cold sweat, realizing that this day was just the beginning of a nightmare. On the third day, the fog lifted, but it did not bring relief. The sun, breaking through the tops of the pines, seemed almost dead. Its light was pale, as if scattered by some invisible filter. The taiga surrounded the camp like a wall, but its gloomy silence became more and more noticeable. Rostovsky spent the night in anxiety. The dream he had had wouldn't leave his head. The voice coming from the anomaly seemed too real to be just a figment of imagination, and the words that he belongs to something echoed heavily in his thoughts. The scientists gathered for a meeting at a large table in the center of the camp. The maps and diagrams spread out in front of them depicted strange geometric patterns, which, according to Kuznetsov, appeared on film taken near the anomaly. "These shapes," said the professor, pointing to the diagram. "They resemble fractals, but it's more than that. There is a principle of symmetry here that goes beyond our geometry." "What does that mean?" Rostovsky frowned. Kuznetsov straightened up and adjusted his glasses. "This means, comrade captain, that we are dealing with something that may be completely inhuman in nature." These words sent a chill through the camp. Even the soldiers, who had been wary but calm until now, began to exchange glances. Vasily, having heard the conversation, quickly moved to the edge of the camp and began to cross himself again. "How can we explore this without putting ourselves at risk?" one of the assistants asked. "We can't," Kuznetsov replied harshly. It was decided to continue the experiments. This time, a group of scientists has installed several devices around the anomaly that can detect temperature changes, radiation, and sound. The generators started up with a strained hum, making everyone jump at the unexpected noise in this dead silence. When the first device was activated, the flash occurred again, but this time not as bright as before. The air around the anomaly began to distort even more, as if an invisible eye had opened wider, examining people. "I'm recording an increase in temperature to 70 degrees Celsius, one of the assistants muttered, recording the data. "But only inside the radius of the anomaly. Outside, the temperature is normal." One of the soldiers watching the trial suddenly staggered back. "Did you see that?" There was someone there. Everyone whirled around. In the center of the anomaly, amidst the trembling air, an indistinct silhouette appeared for a moment, elongated, tall, with unnaturally long arms. But before anyone could make out the details, he was gone. Kuznetsov whispered, wiping the sweat from his forehead with a trembling hand. But what shocked everyone the most was something else. Immediately after this event, sounds began to come from the anomaly. Muffled, distorted, like screams breaking through a thick wall. "Write it down," Kuznetsov commanded sharply. Microphones picked up distorted words that were impossible to make out. The group was silent, listening in fascination as human voices made their way through the rustle and hum. It seemed like someone was calling for help. "Are these ours?" one of the soldiers whispered. The ones who disappeared? But no one answered. At night, events took an even more ominous turn. A strange silence enveloped the camp, but it was not soothing, but a frightening silence, like before a storm. Rostovsky, sitting in his tent, heard strange noises. When he went outside, the guards with machine guns in their hands were standing, listening to something. "Comrade Captain!" one of them said. "There's someone there." "Where?" Rostovsky asked, clutching his pistol. The soldier pointed to the clearing. In the light of the moon, one could see that the distortion in the center of the anomaly had become larger. Now it didn't look like quivering air, but like a hole through which dim green light seeped. Suddenly a sound burst out of the anomaly, a long, low, like the roar of an animal. Then a whisper. But it wasn't only Rostovsky who heard that whisper. "Who are you here?" The words are broken and distorted, but clearly distinguishable. There was a panic in the camp. Vasily took off running towards the forest, shouting prayers. Rostovsky raised his pistol, but his hand trembled. Never before, even on the battlefield, had he felt such animal terror. The words of the whisper sounded clearer now, becoming a command, addressed to everyone at once. "Come in. Find out." No one slept that night. By morning, the camp resembled a disturbed beehive. People walked around with red eyes from insomnia, tense and gloomy. Even the most cold-blooded soldiers, accustomed to deadly battles, were overwhelmed by what was happening. Vasily disappeared at night. His belongings remained untouched, but neither he nor any traces were found. It was as if this event had broken through a fine line that restrained collective fear. "This is already going beyond all bounds," Rostovsky said coldly, turning to Professor Kuznetsov. "Your instruments and conclusions do not provide answers. We're risking people's lives, and I need to know what justifies it." The professor, usually confident and meticulous, looked exhausted. There were dark circles under his eyes, and sweat stood out on his temples. "Comrade Captain," he began cautiously, "we are dealing with a phenomenon that has probably never been encountered by mankind. This is not just a natural anomaly, it's going beyond our world." "What do you mean by that?" Rostovsky frowned. Kuznetsov sighed and took out one of the diagrams laid out on the table. "These distortions, green light, sounds, all this indicates some form of space that intersects with ours. I can't give an exact explanation, but it looks like it's some kind of passageway." "The passage?" Rostovsky's voice became sharper. "Where to?" "I do not know," the professor replied, avoiding the captain's gaze. At this time, one of the assistants, a young man named Likachev, abruptly got up from his desk. His face was pale, and his lips were trembling. "We have to leave! Stop it!" he shouted, addressing everyone. "This is not research, this is suicide! Vasily ran away because he realized that we were strangers here." "Sit down!" Rostovsky barked, his voice sounding like a gunshot. "As long as I'm in command of this squad, not a single person will leave without an order." But Likachev's words had already stuck in the minds of the others. The atmosphere became even more tense, and time seemed to slow down, as if Taiga herself was clutching them in her paws. When the group returned to the clearing for another experiment, the anomaly looked even bigger and brighter. The green light became pulsating, as if the object had a heart that was beating with uneven force. The professor gave instructions to install a new probe, now with a reinforced cable. The soldiers, reluctantly obeying, began the installation, talking in whispers. "I'll come in." One of the scientists, a tall, thin man by the name of Sorokin, suddenly said. "What?" Kuznetsov turned sharply to him. "If this is really a passageway, I should try to enter," Sorokin said firmly. "We won't know anything if we just watch." "This is madness!" one of the assistants shouted. "You saw what happened to the soldier who was sucked in!" But Sorokin was adamant. He slowly approached Rostovsky. "Comrade Captain, this is my choice. If we're going to investigate this phenomenon, we have to go all the way." Rostovsky looked at him in silence. There was a shadow of doubt in the captain's eyes, but then he nodded. Good. Just do it on my command. The group gathered around, holding their breath. Sorokin slowly approached the anomaly. The air around him began to tremble and his clothes fluttered slightly, as if in the wind, although there was no wind. The temperature in the radius is rising, one of the assistants shouted, looking at the device. Sorokin took another step. His silhouette became strangely distorted, as if he was looking through a curved mirror. Then another step, and suddenly his body glowed with a bright green light. Sorokin! Someone from the group shouted. But at the same moment, he was completely engulfed by the anomaly. Everyone froze. There was absolute silence for a second. Even the whispers of the forest disappeared. And then, a scream came from the anomaly. Sorokin's cry. But it sounded as if it was coming simultaneously from an endless distance, and right next to each of them. The voice was full of horror, despair, and pain. Then, everything went quiet. We lost him, Kuznetsov muttered, lowering his arms. But the worst part was that the anomaly had changed. Now it began to expand, as if stretching upward, like a giant pillar of light that disappeared somewhere in the sky. What have we done? Someone whispered. But there was no response. The taiga swallowed them up again in its endless darkness. The camp was in a daze. Sorokin's death and his terrible scream, echoing in everyone's heads, not only shocked people, but literally drained the remnants of their will out of them. Likachev, the professor's assistant, was sitting on the ground with his head in his hands, sobbing and whispering incoherent prayers. The soldiers, usually collected and silent, were now talking furtively, often glancing at the clearing, where the anomaly continued to pulse with green light, casting eerie reflections on the surrounding trees. Rostovsky stood at the edge of the camp, clutching a pistol in his hand. Guns, the only thing that still inspired a little confidence, seemed absurd in this situation. He kept a close eye on the center of the clearing, where the green glow waxed and waned, as if a huge heart was beating there. At times, it seemed to him that the glow was looking at him. Professor Kuznetsov was sitting at a camp table, bent over maps and diagrams, but his face was gray, like a man who no longer believes in the possibility of salvation. He kept his head down, and his hands were shaking so much that the pencil he was trying to take notes with fell out of his fingers. Rostovsky went up to him. "What's going on?" he asked in a cold voice. Kuznetsov looked up at the captain with a mixture of fear and impotence. "I do not know," he replied. "This is more than we could have imagined. The anomaly. She's changed. It's no longer just a refraction of light or a strange energy." "You mean it's alive?" Rostovsky narrowed his eyes. "I do not know," the professor whispered. "Perhaps that's reasonable." The captain paused for a moment, considering what he had heard, and then slowly nodded. "If it's intelligent, then it can be destroyed." These words should have sounded confident, but even Rostovsky felt his voice falter. Late in the evening, when the camp was plunged into tense anticipation, the whispers coming from the anomaly suddenly changed. Now they were not just echoes, but distinct words spoken in different voices. "The way is open. Come in. Find out." The words weren't just coming from the clearing. They were heard right in the heads, filling the consciousness of everyone who was in the camp. Some of the soldiers' legs began to give way. Likachev jumped up and shouted, "It's them! They're calling us. We shouldn't stay here." "Shut up!" Rostovsky barked, but his voice no longer had the same authority. The whispers grew louder. Now, a strange low sound has been added to them, resembling the hum of a huge mechanism. Then something terrible happened. One of the soldiers, Nikitin, suddenly rushed to the anomaly. "Nikitin! Back!" the captain shouted. But it was too late. A young soldier, as if in a trance, crossed the border and disappeared in an instant in a pulsating light. and then something new began to appear on the surface of the anomaly. People froze, afraid to breathe. An image slowly appeared in place of the pulsing light. It was space. Huge, cold, and silent. Nikitin's body was visible among the stars and the black void. It was spinning slowly, as if trapped in invisible currents. His face was turned directly towards the onlookers, frozen in horror, with his mouth open, from which a thick stream of blood was escaping. "Oh my God!" someone gasped. But the nightmare didn't end there. After a few seconds, the image froze and a sound like distant thunder came from the anomaly. Then everything went quiet again. The soldiers backed away, and one of them fell to his knees, panting. Even Rostovsky, always collected and unshakable, felt his legs tremble slightly. "We have to destroy this," he said, finally finding his voice. "With what?" whispered Kuznetsov. "How will you destroy something that exists beyond our understanding?" The captain did not answer. Instead, he turned his gaze to the anomaly, which now seemed even bigger and scarier. It seemed to grow, expanding upward, its green glow becoming almost dazzling. Someone from the group muttered, "It's waiting for us. It wants us to come in." These words hung in the air like a sentence. The night over the taiga was pitch black. Even the stars, usually bright and impassive, seemed dim now, as if they too were retreating before what was happening. There was an oppressive silence in the camp. Everyone who could still move gathered around the campfire, sitting as close to each other as possible. No one spoke. Their faces were dead, and their eyes were empty, as if the last drops of hope had been drained from them. Rostovsky walked slowly past the soldiers, peering into every face. He knew that their faith in him, in the commander, was crumbling by the hour. The whispers from the anomaly did not stop. Now they sounded like an endless chorus of voices merging into something monotonous and infinitely sinister. "What are you going to do?" Professor Kuznetsov asked quietly, standing next to the captain. "Destroy it," Rostovsky replied, without taking his eyes off the pulsing green light. "You don't understand," the professor whispered, his voice trembling. "It can't be destroyed. It's part of something bigger. We opened the door, and now it can't be closed." The captain turned to him.
"If this door can be opened, then it can be locked."
He walked over to the remaining equipment in the camp, picked up a box of explosives, and turned to the group. "I'll go alone. If I'm not back in 15 minutes, get the people out of here." "This is crazy," one of the soldiers said, but his voice was weak. Rostovsky said nothing. He slung a dynamite belt over his shoulders, checked the detonator, and headed for the clearing. The green light of the anomaly was blinding, and the closer he got, the more he felt its effects. The pressure increased, the air became viscous like water, and every movement was difficult. The whispers grew louder, turning into a buzz that made my ears ring. "You came!" said the voices, merging into one. Rostovsky stopped at the edge of the anomaly, looking straight into its center. There in that pulsing green mass, he saw something new. It was an eye, huge, glowing, radiating unfathomable power. He was looking right at him. "You're nothing. You're just a part of—" the voices continued. Rostovsky raised the detonator, looking into that creepy eye. "I may be nothing," he said, "but I'm going to stop you anyway." He took a step forward, but at that moment the world around him changed. Taiga disappeared. He was now standing on a gigantic plain where there was no heaven or earth, only endless light and endless darkness. Voices surrounded him from all sides, whispering, shouting, laughing.
"You can't stop what's always been,"
a booming voice rang out.
"We'll see,"
Rostovsky replied, and pressed the detonator. The explosion happened instantly, but he did not hear it. Instead, the world around him shattered into thousands of pieces like a broken mirror. The hum stopped, the whispers subsided, and the next second Rostovsky was on his knees, back in the clearing. The green glow disappeared. The anomaly was no longer pulsing, it just wasn't there. The taiga was filled with sounds again, the rustle of leaves, the cry of distant birds. The soldiers and scientists standing at the edge of the camp couldn't believe their eyes. Rostovsky stood up, looking at the charred circle in the center of the clearing where the anomaly had once been. He wiped his forehead, breathing heavily, and returned to the camp. "It's gone," he said. "We're done here." But even he understood that this was not the end. Taiga remained a silent witness to what happened. The expedition was curtailed. The documents and records were strictly classified. None of the survivors could explain what had happened, but there was an entry in Rostovsky's diary. "We have closed one door, but how many more such doors are left open?